I was delighted when Sarah asked me to come and do this because some of my favorite memories are shared with Frank Hare. A long time ago, a group of people, mostly men, would drive down to Louisville once a week to record textbooks for the blind. We'd pile into the car and drive down to Louisville and do our job, and then we'd share lunch in a favorite place and come back. And for a couple of years, Frank was part of that club. So we got to share his wisdom and his wit and solving some of the problems of the world and some problems the world didn't know it had. As far as what we were doing in Louisville, Frank was very overqualified. That was back when the recording was done on tape. And each team had, there had to be teams, a director and a reader. And I was the reader, and Frank was the director, which was a much more overstated case than the name doesn't quite describe the job, because what he had to do was sit there and listen to me. I read algebra texts. So he sat there and listened to me read scintillating prose like x plus y equals 12, and it got real exciting, maybe tangent theta equals a over b. And he'd have to listen to me do this, and if I made a mistake, he'd correct me and stop and back the tape up and start it up. And eventually, when we'd come to the end of a page, for some reason or other, he had to check and be sure that there wasn't an extraneous noise on the tape. And whenever I hear somebody say clear, I hear Frank say, "Oh, it's clear." Because he said that over and over. Finally, he got to read a little bit, but I think they didn't appreciate his beautiful way of talking didn't fit with algebra. Finally, he moved on to better things. Yesterday, I docented at Dr. Hutchings' office for HMI, and I felt like I was treading on sacred ground because Friday was Frank's day, and anybody else really didn't belong there on Friday. But he doesn't do it anymore. But I still remember when he would come in armed with 2 flashlights and all kinds of knowledge of Dr. Hutchings and the state of medicine in the 19th century, and nice stories about Queen Victoria. And he gave, I'm sure, the best tours that have ever been given at Dr. Hutchings' office. I'm sorry I never stayed for one of them. I never did see what he did upstairs, but I'm sure it was something that would be remembered by those tourists as something they were glad they came to Madison for. And then on another more personal volunteer note, our daughter Bonnie and her friend Herb live in Alaska, and they are ardent fisher people, and whenever they would come to our house, they would bring a whole bunch of frozen fish, and we did not have a big enough freezer. So we asked Frank, could we maybe leave some of our fish in your freezer, and he graciously consented to let us use his freezer for Bonnie and Herb's fish, and that led to some very interesting visits too. And finally, whenever he came about a book that he thought I ought to read, he'd be sure that I got it, and my library still has some very welcome books about things like the history of the earth and anthropology and other very non-physics things that he thought I ought to know about. So thank you very much, Frank, for being Frank. We love you.